Maybe you can hold the microphone up.
Get closer.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, so the question when you're awaiting a speaker often will be, well, what exactly is he? Where does he come from? Who does he represent? In the case of David Swanson, if you look at Wikipedia, you'll see that he's an American activist, author, and blogger, which sort of leaves you wondering, well, what does that mean exactly? Is he a political partisan? Well, he has worked on a campaign. He was press secretary for someone most of you have probably heard of, Dennis Kucinich, 2004. Washington director for Democrats.com, on the board of Progressive Democrats of America. But that would be too limiting. I'd go to some older words like polymath and autodidact, because he really does cover the waterfront in terms of issues from peace to the death penalty, from climate change to promoting a living wage. And he answers really to no party boss or bureaucracy. He could also properly be called a gadfly or even a conscience. One of his blogs is called simply "War is a Crime." His Facebook page is "Let's Try Democracy." Every generation produces a handful of individuals who play the role of the little boy in the crowd who says, "The emperor has no clothes." Reminding us that we can be better. Drawing the connections, as Dr. King did, between poverty and wealth, war and racism. David Swanson is in that tradition. He will probably not die rich, but the world will be richer for his having lived. David Swanson.
Thank you, and there's some books over there. Maybe there's a chance I'll die rich. Thank you to Alex and Tony and Paulette and Maryland United for Peace and Justice. And we just had a great discussion at this table, a bunch of us for the past hour or so, led by Reverend Baxter and David Harrington. I'm sorry if any of you missed that, but this is a great space for me to be in. I have one slight correction. I did some time back make sure I was not on the board of Progressive Democrats of America because of the word Democrats, although I also don't think America is the way we should be activists. I think it should be humans, and frankly I'm having a little bit of worries about how progressive is getting defined, so I had to get out of there, but a bunch of great people, meaning entirely well and doing some good work. Several years ago, a bunch of peace activists were eating in a restaurant in Crawford, Texas, and we noticed George W. Bush. He was actually a cardboard version of George W. Bush, like you might get your photo of at the White House, but you know, about as lifelike as the real thing. And we picked him up, and we stood him in the corner of the restaurant, facing the corner, and we asked him to stay there until he understood what he had done wrong. And for all I know, he's still standing there. And, of course, a piece of cardboard wasn't really going to understand what it had done wrong, and the real president probably wouldn't have either. The benefit of standing him in the corner, if there was one, was for everybody else in the restaurant. And the benefit of impeaching or prosecuting Bush for his crimes and abuses would have been, and still would be, for the world, not for him, and not for those who are angry at him. We shouldn't imagine that vengeance would be very satisfying. Not when you punish a man, and not when that man destroys a nation like Iraq. Wishing others ill does ill to yourself. It cannot be truly satisfying. 12 days from now, I'll be down in Dallas for the dedication of the Bush Library, or what we call the Bush Lie-berry. A $500 million project aimed at burying lies. We will be there to unearth what should not be forgotten. Now, I'm not so simple-minded as to believe that Bush ran the entire country on his own. I know how Dick Cheney manipulated him. I know that if people wanted to protest Cheney's disastrous role, they could find him living near here at 1126 Chain Ridge Road in McLean, Virginia, as well as 7879 Fuller Road in St. Michael's, Maryland. Not that I would ever recommend holding massive noisy protests at either one of those homes. I also realize that there is a permanent military, industrial, corporate, bankster complex. I know that the Democrats controlled the Senate that voted for the war on Iraq. I know that the corporate media spoon-fed the war lies to my friends and neighbors. But we should be holding all of these parties accountable, not excusing the man who was seated in virtually a royal throne just because he had a lot of help and encountered a massive outpouring of obedience. When we tried to impeach Bush, people accused us of being cruel and vengeful, and I denied it. I said that I was concerned about precedents being set for the future. But the fact is that a lot of people in the movement enjoyed being cruel and vengeful, and at moments I did too. It's great fun to point to a leader as the embodiment of evil policies. It humanizes structural wrongs. We are actually up against the very same things, the very same interlocking evils that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said we were up against when he spoke at Riverside Church 46 years ago last week. We're facing militarism, racism, and extreme materialism. But how do you take those and stand them in the corner? How do you mock their funny accents or their bad grammar? How do you throw shoes at them? We had a lot of fun denouncing Bush as an idiot and a liar. We had so much fun that we forgot he was an idiot when we were calling him a liar. Now, don't get me wrong, he knew perfectly well he was lying. That has been completely established. This is a man who told Tony Blair he'd like to paint an airplane with a UN logo, fly it low over Iraq, get it shot at, and thereby start a war. And who then, moments later, walked out together with Tony Blair to the White House press corps and declared his intention to avoid war if at all possible. This is a man who was asked after the invasion why he'd made the claims about the weapons, and he replied, "What's the difference?" But here's what I do mean to say. Every leader who launches or continues a war does so using lies, always, without exception. But some of them tell their lies better than an idiot. Some of them don't pick obvious lies or lies that can be swiftly exposed by events. Not everyone caught on to this. Some opposed the war on Iraq without opposing the war machine that generates new wars. Some even started calling Iraq the bad war and Afghanistan the good war, as if you can have a good war. Some imagined that because Iraq was based on lies and launched against the will of the United Nations, Afghanistan must have been based on truths and launched with UN authorization. That was not the case. The UN approved of the occupation of Afghanistan 2 months into it. That is how conquest has worked for millennia. Treaties and courts had been in place to pursue prosecution of alleged 9/11 terrorists, and the Afghan government was open to such arrangements. Attacking the people of Afghanistan was not self-defense or moral or legal in any way, not even under the UN Charter, much less some of the stronger laws that we generally tend to ignore. The Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, for example, bans all war. It is the product of a peace movement of our great-grandparents that sought the elimination of war and has much to teach us. We ought to have opposed the war on Iraq because it killed people. There is no better reason. But then we would have had to oppose all wars. They all kill people. It sounds so much more reasonable to oppose particular wars. Half of our neighbors work for the war industry. What about their jobs? North Korea may attack us at any moment. There are evil people in the world who want to kill us. Our government is pursuing economic and military policies that are sure to make them really want to kill us. We can't oppose all war. Well then, we needed to find a different reason to oppose the war on Iraq, and we found lots. And they were all bad ones. And I'll give you 4 examples. 1, the war on Iraq was bad because Iraq had no weapons. What's wrong with that? Well, it implies that nations that do have weapons should be bombed. That would include our nation, by the way, above all others. But more immediately, it would include Iran, which is being falsely accused of having weapons exactly as if that's grounds for bombing that country. Number 2, the war on Iraq was bad because Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. This implies that if the government of Afghanistan had anything to do with indirectly supporting anyone involved in 9/11, then the people of Afghanistan, most of whom had never heard of 9/11 and still haven't, should be bombed. The same logic is costing drone strike victims their lives by the thousands. Number 3, the war on Iraq was bad because it wasn't being won. This, of course, contributed to escalating the war in hopes of winning it, whatever that would have meant. Number 4, the war on Iraq was bad because it was a Republican Party war. This was not entirely true, of course. It was also a position destined to create support for wars whenever a Democrat moved into the White House. The argument for opposing little bits of militarism rather than the whole thing is that more people are likely to quickly join you. If you appeal to their patriotism or partisanship or religion or militarism, but nudge them toward opposing one particular war for some tangential reason, well then maybe they'll be ever so slightly more likely to oppose the next war or the next war. I don't accept that argument. For one thing, ill-informed as I think people are, I don't think they're stupid enough not to notice when I'm telling the truth and when I'm not, when I'm actually making up excuses for a position that I hold for a different reason. I actually want wars ended because they kill people. If I claim to oppose just the Iraq war, but not the Afghanistan war, what happens when the Iraq war ends and I shift to opposing the Afghanistan war? Who will take me seriously? Also, if we don't tell the truth, people never find out how bad the wars are. And if they do find out how bad the wars are, then they oppose them along with us for all the right reasons, reasons that carry over to counter-recruitment and conversion. That is, to keeping our kids from becoming cannon fodder and converting our war industries to peace industries, which, by the way, produces more and better paying jobs for the same investment, not to mention greater happiness in your career. It's not easy to tell people how our wars really look while telling them that you support the troops and want to see the wars waged with better strategies. Our wars are one-sided slaughters. U.S. deaths in Iraq were 0.3% of the deaths. Iraq lost a greater number of people and a greater percentage of its people than the U.S. lost in its civil war, or than Japan or France or England or the U.S. lost in World War II. Iraq lost millions of refugees. Its education system, its health system, its entire society, the nation was destroyed. And a majority of Americans believes that Iraq benefited from the war while the United States suffered. We were happy year after year to see a majority of Americans say they wanted the war ended. But many of them were saying they wanted this act of generosity ended, not the war as it actually existed. The trillions of dollars spent destroying Iraq and not rebuilding it could have been put to other uses. It could have eliminated world hunger. It could have saved many times the lives it was used to kill. But that would require real generosity, not just frustration that a war wasn't being managed well. I was involved in working hard to make sure people knew Bush lied about Iraq, and I'm pleased that a slim majority still says it knows that. I don't know how long that will last. But an overwhelming majority still believes some other war could be a good war. Sitting on a train recently, I spoke to a young woman who told me she was studying dentistry and would soon be in the Air Force. Couldn't she be a dentist without the Air Force, I asked. No, she answered, not without $200,000 in debt. Yeah, I replied, I understand, but without the Air Force, we could have free college and no debt for anybody. No, she replied. And if you think for a moment, I bet you can guess what she said next. And it had nothing to do with lies about Iraq, or the financial cost of Iraq, or the number of U.S. troops killed in Iraq, or what warmongers the Republicans are. It had nothing to do with any of that. I said we get rid of the Air Force and we have free college. And what do you think she said? Any guesses?
We need the Air Force.
We need the Air Force. Why?
Protect our freedom.
Yeah. She said if we don't have the Air Force, the Koreans will kill us. Now, if you have a bit of education, you may realize that North Korea spends less than 1% what the United States does on war preparation. That North Korea couldn't attack the United States without being completely obliterated, and that any nation on Earth would scream angry threats if we pretended to drop nuclear bombs on it after having destroyed all of its cities, killed millions of its people, and threatened and antagonized it for over half a century through control of the military belonging to its former other half. But if you just learned that the war on Iraq was a dumb war that cost too much, that nothing is more heroic than militarism, that even the peace movement should be led by soldiers, and that waving flags and valuing a particular 5% of humanity to a special degree are admirable values, where would you be? There will always, always, always be a North Korea that is about to kill us. We don't need rapid response fact checkers. We need citizens with some understanding of history, with knowledge of the other 95% of humanity, with the capacity to resist terrorism by television, and capable of independent thought. And to get there, we need a peace movement that moves us at whatever pace it can toward peace, toward the popular demand for the absolute abolition of all war. And to get there, we need to stop behaving like politicians. Now, politicians, legislators have to compromise, and would have to compromise even if our government weren't so corrupted by money. But we don't. Our unions and activist groups didn't have to ban the words single payer from rallies for the so-called public option, thus pre-compromising and predictably ending up with neither. We can let Congress do the compromising, but it will do it from wherever we begin. And if we begin with self-censorship, we lose. When Bill McKibben picks Bernie Sanders as his model, he's picking one of our better legislators. He shouldn't be picking any of them as a model for activism. Instead, he should be looking to leaders of the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the labor, peace, and justice movements. He should be looking to activist models in Tunisia, Egypt, Spain, South Africa, South America, Eastern Europe. Activists' work is to speak the truth and non-violently move the nation. Loyalty to political parties and officials is misplaced. Elections are pretty unimportant. We need teachings, sit-ins, boycotts, protests, marches, and direct actions and artwork and education of every variety. We have so much to do that elections ought not to be sitting anywhere near the top of the list, much less distracting people with something bordering on obsession. I must have received emails from a dozen large organizations this week on the topic of Social Security with the message, "This isn't what we voted for." Now, they meant to say this isn't what we want. They may have even meant to say this isn't something we'll stand for. But they did vote for it. In voting for President Barack Obama, we knew he would try to cut Social Security, and now he's trying to. Now, you may believe that backing some other candidate wouldn't have stopped him or would have been even worse. But we have to recognize a certain incompleteness in a strategy that says, we will vote for you no matter what, and please end the war, and don't build the pipeline, and don't pursue NAFTA on steroids in the Pacific, and don't cut Social Security, and don't prosecute whistleblowers, and don't go through a list of men, women, and children every Tuesday and pick which ones to have murdered. Even when that strategy shifts to saying, we voted for you, and now we would really like you to end the war and stop building the pipeline and break off the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations and take back your proposal on Social Security and Medicare and free Bradley Manning and abandon the kill list and ground the drones. There's still something notably incomplete, at the very least, in such an approach. Now, President Obama has not killed the same number of people President Bush did. And President Bush gets some of the blame for having expanded the powers that Obama now abuses. But Obama has expanded those powers further still, and he too must take some of the blame for what all future presidents do now. I helped draft about 70 articles of impeachment against Bush, from which Congressman Dennis Kucinich selected 35 and introduced them. I later looked through those 35 and found 27 that applied to President Obama, even though his own innovations in abusive behavior weren't on the list. Bush's lying Congress into war, not that Congress wasn't eager to play along, is actually a standard to aspire to now. When Obama went to war in Libya against the will of Congress, he avoided even bothering to involve the first branch of our government. When Bush locked people up or tortured them to death, he kept it as secret as he could. Obama, despite radically expanding secrecy powers and persecuting whistleblowers, does most of his wrongdoing wide out in the open. Warrantless spying is openly acknowledged policy. Imprisonment without trial is so-called law. Torture is a policy choice, and the choice these days is to outsource it. Murder is, however, the new torture. The CIA calls it cleaner. And Americans tell pollsters that they oppose killing U.S. citizens but support killing non-U.S. citizens. And activists begin to focus on the danger to U.S. citizens as if that's the strategic way to generate opposition. President Obama runs through a list of men, women, and children to murder on Tuesdays, picks some, and has them murdered. We don't know this because of a whistleblower or a journalist. We know this because the White House wanted us to know it, and to know it before the election. Think about that. We moved from the pre-insanity state we were in circa 1999 to an age in which presidents want us to know